I am John Michael Criswell. My pronouns are he and him, and I am a member of the Gene Site Cares team. I am so pleased to introduce our moderator for this evening, Dr. Rachel Earls. Dr. Earls received her PhD in molecular neuroscience and her Bachelor's of Science in Psychology from the University of Georgia. She was a National Science Foundation Fellow on Leadership and Engagement and is focused on community-engaged and cross-disciplinary research in an effort to improve the treatment of mental health conditions. Currently, Dr. Earls is the Medical Science Liaison for Myriad Mental Health in the Southeast.
Thank you so much, John Michael. Thank you everyone for being here today. I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to moderate this wonderful panel, and I'm honored to introduce our panelists tonight. They each, in their own way, have dedicated their lives to making the world better, not just for members of the LGBTQ community, but for all. Antar Bush is a social worker whose special area of focus is working with Black people and the LGBTQ community and addressing the increased barriers and fears associated with living as a person of color. Antar, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Debbie Thomas is a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and this is her second Pride Month panel with Gene Site Cares. Debbie is as passionate about her patients as they are about her. She has a way of making all feel welcome and cared for, and we look forward to hearing how she has been able to do that in her decades of practice. Debbie, we are so grateful for you being here tonight.
Thank you so much.
And last but certainly not least, Brandon Wolf is a nationally recognized advocate for the LGBTQ positive issues and gun violence prevention. Brandon found his passion for social change after surviving the mass shooting at Pulse nightclub in Orlando in 2016, where 49 were killed and more than 50 were wounded. Brandon is the founder of the Drew Project, an organization that sponsors the LGBTQ student groups and provides college funding to future leaders. Brandon, thank you for all that you're doing, and we're honored to have you with us tonight.
Oh, very grateful to be here. Thank you.
So welcome. So let's get started. So we know that coming out can be scary for LGBTQ people, yet it is just one moment of fear in a lifetime of hateful threats. So our goals for this evening are to come away with suggestions and strategies for clinicians to address the following questions. 1, how can the medical and mental health professionals help members of this community manage the anxiety and depression that comes from living with this fear and hate? We also want to address what can LGBTQ people do to help manage their fears and their internalized responses to hate that they may encounter in their daily lives. And then lastly, how can allies, friends, families, and others help members of the LGBTQ community with their mental health challenges? So let's start with Brandon. If you don't mind, can you please tell us about your mental health journey from both before the tragedy you lived through and then after the event?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I appreciate that you framed it in a way that starts with coming out, because for so many of us in the LGBTQ community, that's a pivotal moment in our mental health journey. It is both a relief and a stressor at the same time. It's a weight off of our shoulders. I tell people all the time that it's as if I gave you a character you had to play. Maybe it's Annabelle from Mississippi. And I give you all the things that you need to know about her. She's got a white picket fence. She's got a husband and 2 kids. She has a really beautiful Southern drawl. And every time you walk out the door, you have to be in character. You are Annabelle, and you can only take that character off when you get home. You can imagine how exhausting it would be to go to school as Annabelle, to go to work as Annabelle, to go to social activities as Annabelle, and only really get to be yourself when you get home and take the mask off. That's what LGBTQ people feel before they get to come out to those who are close to them. They are constantly carrying the weight of that character the world has foisted upon them. And that was a moment for me as well. Coming out was very difficult as a kid. It was challenging to tell my parents. They didn't take it very well in the beginning. It was challenging to tell my schoolmates and my colleagues. It's part of the reason that I moved 3,000 miles away from home to visit Orlando, Florida, and never return, because I was looking for a place to belong, a place to be loved and accepted. That was made even more challenging being a person of color. I grew up in a majority white town, a conservative majority white town. When I graduated high school, there were 2,000 kids in my school and only 11 of us identified as Black. So my entire childhood was a struggle to find the corner of the world that I could belong to. And that meant that survival was just a function of who I was. Every relationship I built, every piece of society that I moved in was about surviving as authentic me. What happened at Pulse, I frame it that way because what happened at Pulse did fundamentally shift my mental health journey. It added a layer of trauma and PTSD that wasn't there before. But the truth is that for me and for other LGBTQ people, what happened at Pulse is what we've been afraid of since before the time we came out. The reason that we carve out safe spaces, the reason that we have special bars, the reason that we look for restaurants with a rainbow flag in the window is because we're afraid that in spaces where other people are, there's going to be someone waiting around the corner to throw a fist, to throw a glass, or worse. So I would say that my entire life has been a struggle to find mental well-being in a world that continually tries to devalue the bits of my identity that make me uniquely me. And I also think that I've found a lot of healing in community. I found it certainly before Pulse. I found it in the community here in Central Florida when I moved from across the country. And I certainly found it after the shooting. I found it in the strangers who would hug me in line at the grocery store. I found it in the bank tellers who would offer me a box of tissues after what had clearly been a really rough day. Community has been fundamental in the way that I've been able to heal, not just from Pulse, but from the trauma that I've carried for my entire life, just being a queer person of color in this world.
Thank you for sharing that. And I want to pivot to Antar and ask, did you have a similar story to this in your journey, or was it different for you?
I had some of that I can relate to definitely some of Brandon's story, especially when it comes to that intersection of being Black and being queer and really trying to find your way. I think my challenges around coming out was definitely that anxiety before you came out. You're creating all these scenarios in your head. I was very fortunate to have a grandparent who was very understanding, who was my caretaker, and was very understanding and supportive. I was 14 when I came out, and my journey for coming out has been up and down. However, it has been having that initial support system was vital to the entire process, right? And then now, after I came out, there was definitely some challenges because now I'm dealing with societal social constructs around gender and gender expression and gender policing. But it was, if I didn't have that foundation, knowing, okay, I have grandmom's support right here. This is where it all started. That was the person I was worried about the most. And I think if you ask any LGBTQ person, it's always like one or two people that, like, if they say yes, if they're okay, I'm going to be okay. You hear it all the time. But what happens when that person doesn't say yes, right? And so now your worst, your anxiety and all your fears have now, come to fruition. And so I often tell parents or clinicians or other parents is that is the anxiety that folks around coming out have the most. And especially for Black folks or Latinx folks who have that extra layer of culture around being LGBTQ. I talk about the Black church a lot, and a lot of, I grew up in the church. So if you grow up in the church, you already know that, like, hey, that's not something that's, really supported, and especially in the 90s. So there was definitely a lot of trauma post coming out for me, but not before I came out.
Thank you for sharing. And I think I'm hearing two big narratives that sound similar between your experiences. Is one, the privilege that people outside of the LGBTQ community may not realize they have in terms of their character seeming more authentic, not having to defend their character and then also living their life without that constant fear. You don't realize that that's a privilege until it's something you live. And then the second point is, it sounds like the support system was pivotal for both of you. And so this pivots really nicely to Debbie, a mental health provider. So I want to ask you, Debbie, can you share an example of what you hear from your LGBTQ patients about the fear they live with? And how do you counsel them? How do you make someone feel safe in that space, since clearly support is so pivotal in this process?
I think that's a really good question. And I'm glad that Brandon and Antar gave their responses, because it tags in exactly with what I was going to share in terms of the whole notion of coming out and how that occurs on a continuum. And Brandon, you had mentioned being Annabelle all the time. When do you get to take the mask off? For a lot of people, even being at home, they can't take the mask off. So I just want to take a few minutes and just briefly give 3 quick snapshots. And one is of a 7th grade kid that I worked with 20 years ago. And my daughter went to the same school. She was a senior. She came home and she said, "Mom, you need to do something at school." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "They put little Stevie in the garbage can again today." And her friend went over. They were waiting for softball practice. She went over, and 2 big senior girls come over, and the little 7th grade boys all took off running. But little Stevie's in this big, a great big trash can. They let him out, and they went in and talked to the principal. Well, my daughter didn't know that little Stevie was already my patient. And little Stevie couldn't tell his parents what was going on, because little Stevie wasn't sure himself what was going on. So that snapshot of what he had to deal with in terms of coming to terms with who he was, what he felt internally, and what he could express externally to friends and family, both. So then fast forward to a kid who was my daughter's dear friend in high school. This was her senior year. She came home from school one day. "Mom, you need to talk to Kevin." I had known Kevin as one of my daughter's close little buddies in their little circle since 1st grade. I said, "What's going on with Kevin?" I knew Kevin was gay from early on. Kevin's parents were trying to force him to go. He had confided to my daughter and her friend that he was suicidal. So that's when she came home and said, "Mom, you have to do something." Well, what I found out is they were forcing him to go out of town to Indianapolis for reparative therapy. Well, we all know that that is damning and damaging and just horrid and outlawed in many places, should be most places, all places. Well, his family was pretty strict, toe the line, and I offered, he was not my patient. He was a friend of my daughter's. I was like a mom to him. I offered to meet with his parents and him and my daughter and their other friends, so he would have some allies and support, and meet at my office, a neutral place, not at my house, not at their house. And they declined that. Well, what he had to carry with him was the shame. Number one, shame of who he was, who he inherently was as a human being. And because of that, then he added on top of that the shame that he couldn't even see a therapist locally because his parents didn't want anybody locally to know he was gay. So they're making him go 2 hours out of town to see a therapist. That kid is now 32 and still calls me Mama Deb. And whenever he moved out of town as soon as he graduated, went away to school, never came back. He and my daughter are still good friends. I see him whenever he's home for the holidays. So that's a snapshot of a kid in the 7th grade, a kid in the 12th grade. Then fast forward to my last snapshot is a kid who's now 33 that I met when he was 24. He was from a small town out in the central Midwest. He came out, he's Hispanic. He came out to his family. They were loving and kind and open and accepting. On his 21st birthday weekend, he went out with some friends to the club. Ended up, he got roofied. He got taken by several males in a car. He was hogtied. He was physically assaulted and sexually assaulted multiple times over the course of 3 days. Then they put him in a car, took him to town, and pushed him out at a four-way stop. Now, that young man has struggled, I want to say obviously, but I guess it shouldn't be obviously, but has struggled so much with telling that. Like, I knew him for several years before he told me the story. A gay friend of mine met him out in Colorado, and when they came back here, he came back here to live and referred him to me. And I knew him for a while and just thought, you know, he said anxiety and depression. And I'm always about not what's wrong with you, but what happened. And as he told me what happened and the story rolled out, that's so much trauma and there's so much tangled up stuff. So he got into a lot of different drug use. He's been in and out of rehab probably 4 or 5 times now. I just talked to our mutual friend the other day. He hasn't been my patient for several years. He moved back out of town. But I think of him, and he's a very intelligent, sweet, kind, compassionate young man. We sang together at an open mic one night. We did this beautiful interpretive dance thing. And he's just a lovely, lovely human being. And to be honest, it really makes me mad that all 3 of those kids, I'm old, I'm 66, so they're all kids to me, that they had to suffer the degree that they had to suffer to just be who they are. So I think that goes to what you were saying, Rachel. There's an inherent notion of privilege that comes with you getting to be who you are. I came out when I was 15 to my mother that I was a lesbian. Well, my mom had come home from work. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. She had had a few beers and she said, "You can always trust me. I'm here for you no matter what." I'm feeling all schmaltzy. You know, I was in the 9th grade, 10th grade. And so I told her I was in love with a girl. She turned on me like that and said, "I'm not having no damn lesbian in this house." I carried shame about that. And as an adult who was married to a man and had a child, when something would come on the TV that had anything to do with gay or lesbian, I felt viscerally uncomfortable that many years later. So I'll stop with that, but there's so much that has to be untangled. And Rachel, you asked, how do you keep people safe? I think the way you keep people safe is to honor and respect the space that they need for you to hold, for whether it's tears, whether it's fear, whatever that is, you hold space for them and you listen to their story.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I think listening and communication are narratives we hear a lot, but they can't be undervalued. They're imperative. And when we were talking about Antar and his grandmother being open to his sexuality, you know, it kind of, what about the people who don't have that? You know, where do we start with them? And so I want to pivot to Antar and ask about the risk that Debbie was referring to. So the risky behavior that trauma can lead to. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Oh yeah, that was actually my next thing. Like, so I often start, I am Black, I am queer, I mean, according to the CDC, I should be HIV positive in jail. I have a 25% of being in prison, a 50% chance of catching HIV, and 75% of catching any STD throughout my lifetime. So those are all statistics that I live with every day. And let me say, like, I always talk about, that initial support, right? I came out 2 years after Magic Johnson announced that he is HIV positive, 1994. And, I just remember, my grandmother having like this conversation about, STDs and all of that kind of stuff. And I look at a lot of my friends who I came out with, that initial circle of friends that I had, and they've all, have since passed because they didn't have that same supportive system because they were partaking in risky behaviors. So I had my grandmother to fill me up. I wasn't looking for sex or drugs or other forms of validation. So I often tell folks that like things like HIV, homelessness, a lack of education are like a result of that. HIV is a result of all of that, right? And so those are some of the consequences that will occur from not having that support system in place. And I see it literally every day. And I know a lot of health centers. I'm here in Atlanta, and you can't, I mean, if you're in Atlanta, that's all they talk about in public health is HIV, HIV, HIV. The CDC is here, but yet Atlanta has the highest HIV rate in the country. And so, I mean, we're looking at West African numbers here in Atlanta. And so what is happening here? What's going on? Well, I talk about this every day. This is a transient city. All the Black queer folks that are here, they're running. This is a refugee space for them. They are running from something. And so when they're running from something, they all come here, and they may have not had those support systems, and they are partaking in drugs such as like methamphetamine is really heavy here. They are getting into sex work and doing just a lot of risky behaviors that I truly believe they would not be doing if they weren't running from something.
If I can, I think one of the other things that is so critical to understand about the risky behavior part of what we're talking about is it's also a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It's sort of like cyclical, that there's so much shame in sex as an LGBTQ person. There's shame in the way that we view our own bodies. And I remember growing up, there wasn't comprehensive sex education. And so the things that I learned about sex, I learned online. I'm just at the age where AOL chat rooms were the way that we navigated middle and high school. And the things that I was learning were from people who certainly were not the 16-year-old that they, sent me a picture of themselves. But they were the ones teaching me about sex in the world, and that there was shame to be had. And I know that there were many years in my life where I simply assumed that to be gay and have sex meant to eventually become HIV positive, and that itself would be a death sentence, one that was deserved because that's the community that I had chosen to be a part of. And so we go out and we see people without support systems seeking that validation, that affirmation through sex and through drugs. And then that perpetuates this shame about their bodies and the way they're living. And then that causes them to go out and seek more validation and affirmation from sex and drugs. And you get stuck in this cycle. And at its root is what Antar is talking about, and that is a lack of support from the beginning. It's a lack of support on understanding what it means to live as an LGBTQ person. It's a lack of support affirming that living as an LGBTQ person doesn't mean you are less than, it means you are valued just the same as everyone else. And I think if we begin to address that at its inception, when these are young kids, then we can have a conversation about how do we break the cycle of risky behavior?
So I think you just made incredible points there. And one thing that's not talked about is the timeline of these events. There's no temporal organization. These words are thrown out a lot, but if I'm understanding correctly, it seems like the lack of support then leads to risky behavior, which then leads to more affirmation because you're not getting that support. It happens in a series. And so if you can provide that support early on, hopefully that can help with this process here. And so that being said, with support, I've heard you guys talk about safe spaces a lot. What safe spaces have you found that have been beneficial for you in your journey?
Do you care who goes first?
No, go ahead, Brandon, you can start.
Yeah, I feel like, well, first of all, I think we have to say out loud that the term safe space is sort of like a bad word in society. It's been perverted by people. It's almost used as a cudgel, as if to say you only need a safe space if you're not strong enough to handle the world as it is. But as we were saying before this call, safe spaces are lifelines for LGBTQ people because, and here comes the privilege thing again, the spaces that my peers were safe in when I was growing up were not safe for me. School is not safe when your head is being smashed into a locker. Church is not safe when it comes with conversion therapy on the side. Home is not safe when, a bottle of beer turns into physical abuse with your own parents. So these spaces that were safe for other kids weren't necessarily safe for kids like me. And so we go out and we form community with one another. We form chosen family, and we build those things in safe spaces, safe physical spaces that we create for each other. I found a lot of safety in the local LGBTQ center. They run programming, they do, HIV and STI testing. I've built a lot of community and chosen family in those spaces. And truthfully, I've built a lot of community in bars and nightclubs. I think that's sort of inherent to the LGBTQ experience, is that, in a dark, seedy nightclub is where you found people who were willing to be authentically themselves and also willing to accept you for your authentic self. So, Pulse for me is not just a moment in time. It's not just a tragedy that struck. Pulse was a physical embodiment of the kind of safety and belonging that I didn't think I deserved as a kid. And that's why it resonates so much with LGBTQ people, because Pulse was everyone's safe space. Everyone knows that space in their community that they can go and wear the skinniest pair of jeans they own without being worried someone might call them a faggot. Everybody knows that safe space they can go to and hold hands with someone they have a crush on without being, afraid someone will throw something, without looking over their shoulder first. Those safe spaces like the center and like Pulse exist in all communities. And when they're invaded, like ours was on June 12th of 2016, people feel that it resonates with them.
Yeah, I found I was lucky. Again, I know some people might be familiar with the hit series Pose. They just had their last season, so we did. I was very much a part of like the house and ballroom scene in the '90s and early 2000s, and it's like how vital those communities are to young LGBTQ folks, especially young LGBTQ folks of color, is important to the growth experience. I always tell people, when you come out, you have to go through what I call LGBTQ puberty. It's like you're starting all over again. So that's why I hate when I never date a guy who says he's coming out at 25. Oh, I came out at 25. I'm not dating you or not. You had to come out like in the teenagers, because you have to go through gay puberty. You have to get it out of your system, and like learn how to like be yourself again. And so being a part of the ballroom community, being a part of advocacy communities such as like the William Way Center in Philadelphia, being a part of those, and having other LGBTQ people who just like adopt you. Like I think I don't know, I just never heard about this in the straight community, where like you go into an LGBT community, Black, white, Latin, it doesn't matter, like they will just adopt you. Like you're just a part, and they don't have to know you at all. Like this is your space. And I've just been lucky to have those spaces. I did, had the privilege of growing up in the inner city. I grew up in Philly. So there was just this LGBTQ was pretty much everywhere in downtown Philadelphia in the early 90s.
Thank you for sharing that. And I love that part about them welcoming you with open arms. I mean, I think if you've had to suppress a part of yourself your whole life, and then you allow yourself, that part of yourself, to become a parent, people must just be thrilled for you and want you to feel the same way they feel. So that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
I was adopted by a bunch of drag queens in 1974 because that was my safe spot. They hid me in the dressing room when there was a raid.
Yeah.
And this was just, like that was just a few years after Stonewall. So when we look at the history and look at what our history is, and our, what Brandon and Antar were both saying, you have your family of origin where you get certain things or you don't get certain things. And then you have your family of choice. And that's where you get all the things, or the opportunity to get all the things that you need. I've gotten a lot of that from the LGBTQ community here for many years, and consider myself an ally and an advocate. And I think that I would love to see that be talked about more, that whole notion of, treat, educate, and advocate. All those things are equally important.
So I like your choice of words, your family of choice. We all have people in our lives like that we welcome with open arms. And I think healthcare providers, mental health care providers can be that family of choice. And so Debbie, I want to go back to you and ask, how do you become someone's family of choice, and how do you counsel the survivors who go through trauma, like you mentioned in those snapshots? How do you help them? What is your tactic when you're talking to patients who've been through something like that?
I think you really have to understand, you have to take the time to learn what trauma is. And that's not just, going to a seminar. You have to really lay naked with the devil and really understand all the dimensions of trauma. It's not just trauma. People, we all bring lots of little traumas, and we talk about trauma, we talk about big T's and little T's, and all those are important. And, trauma is, PTSD is the biological fingerprint of trauma. So trauma is held in molecularly in all the cells of the body. There's a great book by Bessel van der Kolk that I get my patients to get when we get to a certain point in therapy. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's really important to understand all of the parts of trauma and how they play a role in all of the dimensions of your life. So a lot of times, it's about letting somebody know your reaction isn't what's abnormal. It was the circumstance or the event that was abnormal. You're having a normal response to an abnormal event. And sometimes it's about giving people things that are really what seems to be simple, but if nobody's ever told you to do these things, you won't know to do these things. Things like grounding yourself. If we were in my office, I'd get up and show patients like standing in the door frame, pushing your hands against the door, pushing your feet into the floor. And you can do this if you're at work or at school or wherever you are, go into a bathroom stall and push and take some breaths in and out. Breathing is really important. If you're breathing from here up, you're retaining CO2, you're going to move towards panic because you're not oxygenating the periphery. Simple little things like count backwards from 100 to 0 by threes. The reason for that, the amygdala, the little fight or flight thing in your brain, it can't activate while doing mathematical calculations. It just can't. It doesn't mean you're not going to have anxiety there, but you're not going to escalate that. And you can't do it by 2s, 5s, or 10s because you can do that in your sleep. But by 3s, you have to calculate. I have one person that said, well, I've changed mine to doing randomly. I'll do by 7 2 times, and then I'll do it by 3s because that's how he does it, And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Name 5 things you can smell, 4 that you can see, 3 that you can taste. It's about the senses, because if you activate the senses, you're taking yourself out of the moment of the fear, because trauma is all about fear. It's an overactivation of that autonomic nervous system, and you get stuck. So if people are holding tension in their hands or their fists, they're kind of stuck in that fight part of fight or flight. If they're holding a lot of tension in their hands or in their feet or their legs, they might be stuck in the flight response. So it's all about teaching them how to manage what might seem like the simple things. But if you're in the moment of a panic attack brought on by trauma because you're out and something is a trigger, I have certain things that are triggering for me, and I've had my own therapy for years. I've done this work for years, but I think it's always important to respect in other people what we cannot see. I don't know what you're bringing to the room. I don't know what you're bringing to the table, what you're bringing to the chair in my office. You might look all fine and dandy, but I don't know what's there until I ask. So I think it's important never to assume because my looks put together and talks well, that they're not really suffering.
Yeah, I would, if I can, I think it's also important that we just acknowledge like that, even trans folks who, I always bring up trans folks because as someone who is cisgender, I sort of have another layer of privilege because I can go in most spaces if I really try. I can be like that masculine guy and just kind of like wing my way through it. But some trans folks who are not, maybe not, are not considered passing or may have more of an androgynous look, they are on the front lines of all LGBTQ folks, because every time, like, they have, they don't come out once. Most trans folks come out 2 or 3 times, maybe one as LGBT and LGB, and then the T comes later. And sometimes, they have an extra layer of trauma, just like getting medical providers to recognize and affirm their transness, and that becomes a trauma. And there's so much research around that and the trauma around trans folks, and then trans folks of color, and what they have to go through, and even within the LGBTQ community.
I think that's a really important point. And I had one experience where we were having a family session, and this kid was in his early 20s, had just finished college, and had come out to his parents when he was younger. And his mom sat there and she said, well, I really just think you're gay. I mean, I knew it since you were a little kid. I really don't think you're trans.
Wow. I'm glad you brought up the trans community. I think that's really important. I think it's not discussed enough. And I will say to the audience, you are able to put questions in the Q&A, and we will get the panelists to answer them for you. There's one that just came up, and the question is, what have your experiences been with non-traditional relationships or alternative lifestyles and diverse gender identities as another layer of coming out? This is open to anyone.
Well, I feel like, maybe I don't have a lot of experience here to share. I have had experiences with non-traditional relationships in the last 5 or 6 years of my life. I don't know that it ever really required me to go through another coming out process. It's not as if my 2 boyfriends met my parents. But certainly it was interesting conversations to have with friends who might be, a part of the LGBTQ community or seemingly accepting and they're allies. But when you start to talk about living your life authentically and doing it in a way that maybe isn't the same that they are, those are uncomfortable conversations to have. And as we talk about stressors and additional trauma, I think it is important to note that, at least in my view, one of the benefits of being a part of the LGBTQ community is that we aren't actually constrained by a lot of the same societal and social standards that exist for heterosexual cisgender people. I don't get the same pressure from my parents to get married at age 22. I don't get the same pressure from my grandmother to have children by age 25. Those things are sort of, I guess, shackles that I consider myself free of. So while there is a sort of sense of coming out or maybe a stress around sharing some of these non-traditional choices that we might make or non-traditional ways that we live our authentic lives, I also think there's a freedom in that that comes as a part of being in the LGBTQ community. We talked about family of choice. That is a non-traditional thing in society. People who are not a part of the LGBTQ community don't often need a family of choice. And I think for us, it's more common than it is uncommon. So I guess the question is around, what has that process been, and is it akin to coming out? And in my view, I actually see it as a benefit and a freedom of being a part of the LGBTQ community, that we get to explore other areas of life that others might not feel comfortable exploring.
That's such a beautiful outlook. I'm sorry, Antar, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was actually going to take it the question in a different direction. So being LGBT, being Black and queer, I never met so many Black or Latinx or just LGBTQ folks in general who want to fit the straight mold, the heteronormative mold. And I always say that you're trying to fit a square into a circle. It's just never going to work. But you meet so many queer folks who are trying to create that heteronormative and I always blame gay marriage. I was never supportive of LGBT marriage. I think everybody should have the right to get married, but I was just never in support of that because I knew what it was going to create. And I see it all the time in LGBTQ relationships where they're trying to create that traditional model, like Brandon was saying, and they don't explore what it really is to be with same gender loving relationships, because it is different. And you're trying to make this guy, because he's more feminine than you, a woman, or you're trying to make this woman who's more masculine than you a man. And that is not, that's gender, that's not sexual orientation. So there is like, sometimes because we're not taught how to have these same gender loving relationships, we're just winging it. I said for 20 years, I just winged it. I didn't know what the hell I was doing in and out of relationships. And so, but now, because I'm no longer trying to fit into those traditions, like Brandon's saying, I am really trying to explore. I'm having much richer and better relationship experiences than I've ever had.
That's so powerful. And I think not being taught a gender loving relationship outside of the heterosexual norm is something that is ingrained in us from a very young age. And it aligns really nicely with some of the questions that we're getting in about LGBTQ youth. So one of the questions that we're getting is, one issue that comes up frequently in our news cycle in the US is corruption of the LGBTQ youth and how they must be protected via mechanisms like conversion therapy or avoiding gender affirming language. As an adult in the LGBTQ community, we therefore have a lot of concern around our children and their treatment, which can get spun into a specter of perversion or agenda forcing. What are your thoughts on how to break this cycle? And the next question is, how do we provide support and outlets to our adolescents? So I think there's big questions about, we know support is pivotal. We know community is pivotal. How do we do this in the adolescent population without seeming like we are forcing an agenda on anyone? And that's a tough question.
I'm really excited to hear Debbie's thought on this, because I think, you know, I'm not a mental health professional, so I'm not an expert on how best to care for kids, but thank you. But you know, one of the things that I did after the shooting at Pulse, and forgive me, I'll get a little personal with you. I lost my very best friend, Drew, that night. I say to most people that he was my chosen brother. He was the first person that taught me to love myself for all of me. And so you can imagine the sort of pain and the hole that that leaves behind. And I know that I don't have to tell folks on this call, but when you experience loss of that kind, when you lose someone you love that much, you go through a range of emotional responses. And one of them is fear. You're afraid that you'll forget them, right? So you listen to old voicemails 100 times. You listen to, you watch old videos so you don't forget the way that they walked. You save that t-shirt so you don't forget how they smelled when they come in the room. And for me, I think one of the other things I was afraid of being an LGBTQ person is that other people wouldn't get to meet Drew the way that I knew him. Other people wouldn't get that same sense of belonging and acceptance and love that he poured out. He was a master of clinical psychology. And so it shouldn't surprise you that his forte was creating spaces for people to be authentically themselves. So in the month after the shooting, I co-founded an organization called the Drew Project. And we asked ourselves, how would we keep those parts of Drew alive? What would be the best way for us to make a difference in the world? And it was really very obvious. In 2002, when he was in high school in rural Florida, Drew started the first Gay Straight Alliance Club in his school. And as you can imagine, rural Florida in 2002 is not exactly the friendliest environment to be starting a Gay Straight Alliance Club, but he felt really passionate about it. And so we started doing that work in his honor. We've sponsored Gay Straight Alliances across the world now and given over $100,000 in college scholarships to emerging queer leaders. So that's a long story to get to the point, which is that I have found the most success in allowing young people space to be themselves and not trying to be their voice, but instead empowering their voices to be themselves, right? And I don't know that that's the answer, because again, I'm not a mental health specialist by trade, but I've just seen the results that when young people have space to live authentically and explore and have rich, robust dialogue with one another and find the power in their identity, that they are unstoppable. And it can't be said that I have an agenda, but rather that they want to be heard for exactly who they are.
Mhm.
Debbie, do you have any input on this topic?
I was a little caught off guard. I was actually really moved by what you just said, Brandon.
Thank you.
I can't add anything to that. That was just perfect.
I have to agree. If I could just add anything, is also as someone who helps support folks through mental health, is when working with adolescents, just you know, when they are exploring, helping them explore in a very safe manner, is just really important. For me, you know. I think sometimes when young folks are exploring, they can go, if boundaries are not set, um, you know, it's very easy for a 16-year-old to look like a 21-year-old. It's very, you know, and if boundaries aren't set and they're exploring, they can explore with the anything with the wrong group or the wrong person. So just making sure you set boundaries. I've had friends of mine who teenagers who have come out, and the first thing they always ask me is, what should I do? And I said, be the same exact supportive parent you were the day before. Create healthy boundaries. If they were going to date girls the day before, now they're dating guys today, allow that. And if they go back to girls the next day, allow that. Just continue to volley and be supportive, because that is what is going to create the healthy adult.
That's fantastic. Thank you guys so much. One other question I think that's very related that comes from the audience is, in my experience, I find that I came out not only once, but hundreds of times with new coworkers, friends, and family. How do you deal with this or explain this reality to people struggling coming out? I think I'm going to pivot this to Antar. And I know specifically as a social worker, you look a lot at systems that make someone more vulnerable too. So I'm wondering if you can comment on this in the context of those systems as well.
Yeah, so when you have to come out multiple times, in multiple situations, that just creates all kinds of levels of anxiety. I know, in employment situations, I have been very fortunate enough to work in spaces where I work in social work, so it's LGBT heavy, right? But I have friends who don't work in LGBT heavy systems, and when they have to, present in systems, they may present more masculine or more feminine, and you're like, how is that? How are you capable of doing that? A lot of times it's survival mechanisms. Black and brown folks have had to do that for years. Is that code switching, right? Being able to act one way in one environment and then present in another way in another environment. And one of the things is, I always, when I'm in systems like doing trainings and like talking to police officers, I hate, I think, was it you, Rachel, I was talking to? I hate training police officers and doctors because in this way that they are trained, they're trained to be the smartest and toughest in the room, right? And there is sometimes no space for anyone else to be smarter or to be tougher around cops and doctors. So when I'm in these systems, I'm like, you have to create the space for the person who knows their body better, the doctor. I say, if this person is telling you, hey, I need to be on prep because I'm having sex, or just I need to be on PrEP. It's not necessarily for you to ask why you need to be on PrEP, right? Because maybe it's just for you to like give it to them, because maybe they don't want to explain all of their sexual activities to you. And the same, so when you're in these systems, and when I'm teaching about these systems to the people who control these systems, I'm like, create the space for folks to be vulnerable so that you can get to the truth and really help folks.
I think that's fantastic. And I also think one thing too that's not discussed that was brought up by one of the attendees is, you do have to come out hundreds of times, but you also don't have to. You don't have to share that with people if you don't want to. It's completely your choice, and that is something that you can control. So I think that's also something to consider there. Debbie, I want to pivot to you, and I want the attendees to leave with something really to grab onto for a tip when working in your office with members of the LGBTQ. What have you found that has provided the greatest relief, the greatest support for members of this community as a healthcare provider? If you could give any tip to any of the healthcare providers on this call.
Yeah, I think there's two forks to that, and one is setting and the other is behavior. So in the office, what's my setting and what's the behaviors of myself and maybe my office manager, other folks in my office that they may pass in the hallway. So, some of the things regards to settings might be that, we do have like the pride flag out in our waiting room and a notice. It's on my website, things in my office that I have there to acknowledge the LGBTQ community. I'm active in our local community as well. So I think there are things in the setting that can be reassuring. When I meet a patient, I don't take new patients anymore, but when I meet somebody that's new, I will introduce myself and share what my pronouns are, because I think that sets the stage for them to know, oh, well, she bothered to say, so that must mean it's okay for me to say. And that I've always had, patients to thank me for doing this. Like, wow, I'm glad you asked. I didn't know. I have that on my, intake paperwork and all that. So I think those are setting kinds of things and some of those little behaviors, but more importantly, I think it's about just really listening. And I was thinking about that last comment about telling your story. You don't have to tell your story. How many times do you have to tell your story? And one of the things that I always tell patients is, number one, you don't owe anybody your story. And if you choose to tell your story, choose wisely. In the beginning, choose wisely. Now, a lot of people are at that point of like, I'll tell my story. If you don't like it, whatever. But you don't owe anybody your story, because for a long time, people have felt like they had to tell their story. And they, if I come out to this person, then I have to tell the people at work. And how am I going to tell this group of people? It's like, who said you had to? And so I think nobody needs my permission for anything, but I'll certainly be there to offer that, to say, hey, did you ever think of this? You don't have to tell it if you don't want to. If you want to, I'm here with you every step of the way.
I think that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a huge part of creating a safe space, is letting them control the dialogue. You can share as much or as little of yourself as you want to. That's your right as a human being. So I think that's wonderful that you foster that in your practice. Brandon, I'm going to shift to you and on a related topic. So you talk a lot about self-care in marginalized communities. So what does that mean for you?
That's a big question. And I've learned a lot about self-care over the last 5 years, especially, there's an amount of challenge that already exists in caring for yourself as a marginalized person in society, because you're constantly in a battle for survival. You're constantly in a struggle against systems and structures that try to devalue you or disassociate you from bits of your identity. And then of course that's compounded with having survived a traumatic event and and having that event be extremely public, and then, you know, being asked to continue to share what happened during that event for the benefit of others so that we can hopefully prevent it from happening again. All of those things are compounded traumas, and it can be difficult to learn how to care for yourself in that space. And what I've found is two things. The first one is, for me, at the root of self-care is forgiveness. And that's been a really tough lesson for me to learn. And forgiveness, not just of others, but of myself, forgiving myself for being alive another day when my best friends can't be, forgiving myself for needing days off when other people don't get that opportunity, forgiving myself for not having the emotional fortitude to do one more news interview or, you know, one more conversation about it because I need to recharge. That has been a really difficult journey. And I think part of that is because I've rooted so much of my healing in purpose and, you know, turned what happened into fuel to hopefully make the world a better place in honor of the people who can't be here anymore. And when you do that, you run the risk of that being, that running you dry, right? That there isn't anything else to live for. So you continue to feel the need to save the world, to earn your place in it. So the first thing that I've learned is I've got to be able to forgive myself for being human. And the second thing I've learned is to demand and feel comfortable demanding the things I need in order to care for myself. One of the things I found interesting in the immediate and ensuing aftermath of the tragedy is that people are very good at reminding you that you need to care for yourself, but people are not always very good at providing you the support you need to do that. So, you know, I'll be at work loaded down with 80 hours worth of work to do for the week. I've got a mountain of emails in my inbox. I've got 25 interviews to do this week. And I get a coworker who gets on a Zoom call and says, you know, you've been working a lot. Are you taking care of yourself? And that is not helpful whatsoever. Instead, it is an added stressor because now you have reminded me that I haven't eaten lunch and I haven't taken a moment to breathe today. And I probably won't get to do that until 8 or 9 p.m. tonight. So one of the little changes that I've made in the way that I interact with my peers, my colleagues, my friends, is to respond to the question of, are you taking care of yourself with, are you offering to take something off my plate to provide me space to care for myself? Because if you're not, that's okay. I think we just need to be clear that you telling me to take care of myself is not helping either one of us. But if you are willing to offer, then I can think of 2 or 3 things that I've been dying to get off of my plate so that I can take care of myself. It would be really helpful if you went to the store and bought bagels for me, because I've been thinking about how I'm out of bagels for the last week, and I do not think I'm going to get to the store. It would be really helpful for me if you could take this project, or if you could make this phone call for me so that I could make sure to take a lunch today. And what I've found fascinating about that is that my friends, my peers, my colleagues stop telling me to take care of myself and lead by asking, is there anything you need help with right now? I'm noticing you're not leaving a lot of space for self-care. So I guess in controlling and demanding the space that I need, I've also trained the people around me how best to support me, and also how to expect support from me in return.
I think that's so wonderful and such a good way to make it actionable. The first thing I think of is when a colleague or friends ask how you're doing, you say fine, and that's where the conversation ends, even though you're not fine, and they mean well by it, but it doesn't translate into a result or anything. So that's a great way to take action. Antar, I'm going to turn the last question over to you. We have 1 minute left. If you had one message you could share with family and friends of the LGBTQ community, what would that be?
I would, if I could just share one message, is definitely, like Brandon said, self-care is vital to everyone's process. Also, look for support if you don't have it, and never be scared to ask for help. And I know that could be a very vulnerable space for some folks, but if you're not vulnerable enough to ask for help, then it's more likely that you won't get it. And so I would definitely, if I could leave with anything, as I always tell people, never be scared to ask for help in the room. If you need help in the room, I'm constantly telling staff that, like, if you need help, ask for the help you need. And that goes for folks, parents, or mental health professionals. If you don't know how to treat a patient who's trans, ask for help. If you don't know how to treat, if you don't know something, ask for the help. even if you're expected to know it, because there's been a lot of things in this world I've been expected to know and I didn't know. So, you know, you can ask.
I always
Thank
think
you.
about the AAA of self-care. We all get AAA for our car, but we don't think about that self-care. I look at it as accept, alter, or avoid. That way I can remember it.
I love it. Well, thank you sincerely to our panelists. Thank you for those who attended. If there were any questions in the chat that we didn't get to, they will be answered after this event. But we just want to thank you all for your time and joining us on this journey. It's been wonderful, and I can't wait to continue on during Pride Month. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your night.